Hello and welcome. I know many of you use this video to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Name of the story: The Disappearing Path. It was early morning when Mark set off for the hike, the kind of crisp, fresh air that made the trees seem alive. He'd heard plenty about the forest trail, famous for its beauty, its peaceful solitude. The kind of place you'd go to escape the noise of life and lose yourself in the calm whispers of nature. What nobody mentioned, though, were the rumors, the warnings whispered behind closed doors. Some say the path changes, that the woods have a way of pulling people in and making them never come out. But Mark wasn't thinking about that. He was focused on the sounds around him: birds, distant rustlings of leaves, the soft crunch of his boots on the forest floor. He had been on plenty of hikes before, and this one, with its breathtaking views, promised to be the same. He smiled to himself as he glanced at his phone to check the time. It was barely 7 a.m. He had the whole day ahead of him. No rush, just nature, just the trees. The sun was barely peeking through the canopy above, casting long shadows across the trail. As Mark walked deeper into the woods, the path seemed to stretch before him, winding its way through the towering trees. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. The sounds of birds and insects were more distant now, replaced by a quiet, almost suffocating stillness. He paused for a moment, unsure of whether it was the silence that unnerved him or something else. Shaking it off, he checked the map on his phone again. The trail should be just up ahead, a sharp turn to the left that led to a lookout point. But when he looked up, the turn wasn't there. Instead, the path continued straight, as though the map had misled him. Mark frowned, puzzled. He glanced at the trees around him, the thick trunks reaching up to the sky like sentinels. Maybe he had missed the turn. It didn't matter. The trail was still beautiful, and the day was still young. He decided to keep walking. He rounded the corner, expecting the view to open up to the familiar overlook, but nothing changed. The trees stood as dense as before, their shadows growing longer, as though they were watching him. He paused again, this time more perplexed than before. Hadn't he just walked past a fork in the path? He turned back to the way he had come, but nothing looked familiar. The same trees, the same ground, the same winding trail, as if he'd never moved at all. A cold chill ran down his spine. It was as though the forest was shifting around him. "Okay, this is weird," he muttered under his breath. He pulled out his phone to check the map again, but it was no use. The screen was glitching, flickering between different locations, none of them matching what he could see around him. He stepped forward slowly, his boots crunching on the dried leaves. The sound was louder now, almost deafening in the stillness of the woods. He pushed forward, determined to find his way. As he walked deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to grow taller, more imposing. Their branches twisted above him, blocking out the sunlight and casting everything in shadow. The path, which had once been clear and inviting, now seemed to narrow, as if closing in on him. Suddenly, he heard something, a faint rustling in the bushes behind him. Mark froze, his heart pounding. He turned around, but saw nothing. The trail behind him was as empty as it had been when he'd first walked past it. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he quickly continued down the path. The forest around him was thick now, the trees close together, the air damp with the smell of earth and moss. Mark had been hiking for what felt like hours, but the day didn't seem to be moving forward. Time seemed to slow, as if the forest was holding him in place, trapping him in its depths. Then he saw something that made his stomach turn. A trail marker, one of those wooden posts meant to guide hikers, but it was crooked and old, half buried in the dirt. Mark bent down to inspect it, and that's when he saw the strange symbol carved into the wood. It was nothing he recognized, just a series of sharp lines twisted together like an ancient rune. He reached out to touch it, but as soon as his fingers brushed the wood, he heard a distant whisper, so soft he could barely make it out. He jerked his hand back, his pulse quickening. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice louder than he intended, but the only answer was the rustling of leaves, the whisper fading into silence. Mark stood still, listening. The wind was picking up, moving through the trees, but something was different. The whispers seemed to come from all around him, swirling in the air, just out of reach. His chest tightened, and he felt a sense of dread settle deep within him. He continued on, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of the path. But with each step, the woods seemed to shift, the trees pressing closer, the trail less distinct. Then ahead of him, he saw something, an opening in the trees, a sliver of light. A sign of hope, maybe. Mark's heart lifted as he moved toward it, pushing through the underbrush. But when he reached the clearing, he stopped dead in his tracks. It wasn't the open space he had hoped for. Instead, it was a small, dilapidated shack, hidden deep within the woods. It was old, the wood gray and rotting, with vines creeping up its walls like fingers reaching for the sky. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Why was there a shack out here? The trail was supposed to lead to a lookout, not this. He approached cautiously, drawn by a mix of curiosity and fear. The door of the shack creaked open on its own, as if inviting him inside. Mark hesitated. He had no reason to go in, no reason to get closer. But something about the place, it felt like it was calling to him. As he stepped closer, he noticed something else. On the ground, scattered in the dirt near the door, were several discarded items. An old, rusted compass, a torn map, and a worn hiking boot, its sole half eaten away by time. He bent down to pick up the compass, but the moment his fingers touched it, a voice spoke from inside the shack. "Get out!" Mark's heart skipped a beat. The voice was low, raspy, almost a whisper, but it was clear. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't his imagination. He backed away quickly, the compass falling from his hands as he turned on his heel and ran, the echoes of the voice following him through the trees. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps as he ran, the sound of his footsteps thundering through the woods. But no matter how fast he went, the trees seemed to close in around him, making the path ahead harder to see. The air was thick now, cloying, and each step felt heavier than the last. It was as though the forest was trying to swallow him whole. He dared not look back. The voice still echoed in his mind, and the chill creeping up his spine made every crack of a branch, every snap of a twig, feel like something hunting him. Finally, he stumbled to a halt, gasping for air, his heart hammering in his chest. He was dizzy, disoriented, his eyes darting wildly around him. There was nothing. No sign of the shack, no path, no markers, just the thick, oppressive forest. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. He needed to think. Think, Mark. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of his mind, the stress of being alone in the woods. But when he opened his eyes again, the trail before him was gone. It wasn't just hidden. It had disappeared. The trees were no longer arranged in a way that made any sense. The ground was uneven, the roots twisting and curling like skeletal fingers reaching up from the earth. The forest felt wrong, unnatural. Mark's stomach churned. He spun around, trying to spot something familiar, anything that could lead him back. But the trees were all the same, their shadows growing longer, darker. Panic began to claw at his throat. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't. He had to find the way out. "Hello!" His voice cracked, swallowed by the silence. His ears strained for any sign of movement, any sound of life in the woods, but there was nothing. Not even the rustle of leaves. Then he heard it, a faint tapping sound, barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. He froze, listening. It was coming from behind him. Slowly he turned, dread pooling in his stomach. The noise grew louder, clearer. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, dragging, slow. But there was no one there. No one Mark could see. The forest around him was still, unnaturally still. He gripped the strap of his backpack, his knuckles white, and started walking again. One foot in front of the other. Keep moving. Don't stop. But the path he had thought he was following had disappeared again, replaced by a tangle of brambles and dense undergrowth. There was no way forward. He was trapped. Suddenly, a figure emerged from between the trees, stepping silently out of the shadows. Mark stumbled back, his heart leaping into his throat. The man standing before him was tall, gaunt, his clothes ragged and torn as though he'd been wandering the forest for years. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy, but what struck Mark the most was the utter emptiness in them. The man was staring at him without seeing him. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The man didn't speak either. He just stood there watching. "Are you lost?" Mark managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and began walking, his pace slow and deliberate. He didn't look back, but the moment he moved, Mark felt an overwhelming compulsion to follow. What choice did he have? If this man knew the way out, Mark had to follow. The stranger moved deeper into the woods, past trees that seemed to shift and bend around him. Mark followed cautiously, his eyes never leaving the back of the man's hunched figure. As they walked, the world around them seemed to warp. The trees no longer stood still. They groaned, creaked, as if they were alive, stretching and pulling themselves in strange directions. The air grew colder with each step, and Mark's breath began to form visible clouds in the still air. "Wait," Mark muttered under his breath, his mind racing. "Where are we going?" The stranger didn't answer. Mark felt the ground shift beneath his feet, a faint tremor running through the earth. He paused, his body tensing. Was it an earthquake? He looked around, but there were no signs of any disturbance, no cracks in the ground or falling trees. But something was wrong. He could feel it. The forest wasn't just alive, it was watching him, waiting. Ahead, the figure of the man reached the edge of another clearing. Mark hesitated for a moment, then followed, stepping into the open space. This time, the clearing wasn't empty. At the far side, something gleamed in the pale light filtering through the trees. A pile of broken items, old and rusted, scattered across the ground like discarded trash. Maps, boots, torn jackets, and something else. Something that made Mark's blood run cold. At the center of the clearing, propped against a tree, was a long, jagged pole. It was made of twisted wood, and it was adorned with strange markings, symbols Mark didn't recognize. It looked ancient, like something from another time. The stranger was standing in front of it now, his back turned to Mark. He raised a hand, touching the pole as though he were paying homage to it. He whispered something, too low for Mark to hear, then slowly turned back toward him. The man's eyes locked onto Mark's, and for the first time, Mark saw something in them. Something familiar. A sense of recognition, like he had seen these eyes before, but he couldn't place where. Suddenly, Mark's mind snapped into focus. The items on the ground, the strange symbols, the broken compass. He had seen this before. This was the same trail that had been marked on his phone, the one he had been following before everything started to go wrong. He reached out instinctively, grabbing the man's arm. "Your weight. What is this? What's happening here?" The stranger's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was empty. The man's voice was a low rasp, barely a whisper. "You should not have come." The words sent a cold shiver through Mark's entire body. He released the man's arm, stepping back in fear. What do you mean?" Mark stammered. He couldn't breathe. The forest seemed to close in even tighter, the trees bending inward, the air thickening. But the stranger's eyes were still locked on him. He stepped back, disappearing into the shadows, and with him, the sense of dread followed. Mark stood frozen in the clearing, his heart pounding against his chest. The man had vanished, melting into the shadows as though he was part of the forest itself. The air was thick, pressing against him, suffocating him. He could still feel the weight of the stranger's eyes, like invisible fingers grasping at his soul. The forest seemed wrong. The trees, the ground, even the air. It was as if reality itself was bending around him, folding in on itself. He looked around desperately, searching for something familiar, anything to prove he wasn't lost, truly lost. But all he could see were the same twisted trees and the broken, scattered remnants of other hikers who had never found their way out. Something shifted behind him, a soft rustling. Mark whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. He saw nothing, but the sound lingered, swirling around him like a whisper in the wind. He backed away slowly, his eyes scanning every corner of the clearing, but it was no use. The trees felt too close, their dark limbs reaching down toward him like grasping hands. It wasn't just the trees anymore. It was the very ground beneath his feet, as though the forest had a mind of its own, manipulating the world around him. Mark's vision blurred for a moment, a dizzying sensation spinning his thoughts. He could hear the whispers again, faint and muffled, like a distant conversation, but with no clear source. "Get out! Get out! Now!" The voice was clearer this time. It was low, guttural, like the groan of the earth itself. Mark's legs trembled beneath him. He turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of trees. The wind had picked up, carrying the whispers farther into the forest, as if beckoning him forward. A sudden thought hit him. The trail. He needed to find the trail again. He had to leave, but he wasn't sure which direction he had come from. The path had shifted again. He could feel it in his bones, in the pit of his stomach. The forest was alive, twisting, bending, mocking him. He glanced at his phone. The screen was cracked now, the map glitching, showing random coordinates. Mark's heart raced. He was miles deep into the woods, and with each passing moment, he felt further from the world he knew. The thought of the shack, of the strange man, was all too fresh in his mind. The feeling of being watched, he couldn't shake it. Every part of him screamed to run, to leave this cursed place before it consumed him too. "Hello," he called out into the silence, but his voice sounded foreign, weak. He waited, his breath heavy in his chest, straining to hear any response. Nothing. Mark started walking again, his steps quicker now, almost frantic. He moved through the forest, weaving between trees, his eyes scanning for anything that could resemble the trail he had been on. His breath came in sharp bursts, the silence around him oppressive. And then he saw it, the faintest glimmer through the trees, something not quite right. It was a flash of movement, not human, but almost animal. Mark stopped, every instinct in his body telling him to run, but something made him stay. It was a figure, hunched and skeletal, moving between the trunks of the trees. The figure was tall, too tall, and its limbs were unnaturally long, twisting in ways that no human body should be able to bend. Mark's blood ran cold as the figure stopped, its head turning slowly toward him. There was no face, just a shadow where the features should have been, a deep void of blackness staring at him. The world seemed to freeze around him, the wind halting, the trees holding their breath. It made a sound, low like a growl, but something else mixed in, a whisper, a voice Mark couldn't understand. "Not yet." The words echoed in his head, the voice distorted and unsettling. Mark didn't wait to process it. He turned and bolted, his legs burning as he ran through the forest, the ground slipping beneath him. The figure's low growl faded into the distance, but he could still feel it, a presence, watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. His mind raced as he pushed forward, branches slapping against his face, the air thick with dread. He didn't know where he was going anymore. There was no path, no trail, only the endless expanse of trees that seemed to stretch on forever. The trees were closing in on him again, the spaces between them narrowing. He was being funneled deeper into the forest. And then it came, the feeling, the unmistakable sense of being surrounded. Mark stopped dead in his tracks, his chest heaving, his body frozen with fear. He could feel the weight of eyes upon him. not just from one direction, but from all around him, pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. He turned in a circle, his eyes darting in every direction, but the forest was silent, as though it had swallowed every sound. It was then that he realized the trees had shifted. The path was gone. The forest was different now. What had once been a familiar, winding trail had transformed into a maze of twisted roots and gnarled branches. And then a voice, a whisper right behind him. "You shouldn't have come." Mark spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, silent, motionless. "Get out?" The voice was clearer this time, coming from the depths of the woods, beckoning him toward it. Mark couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else. His heart raced, every fiber of his being telling him to leave, to run far away from this cursed place. But there was no escape. He took a hesitant step forward, and then another, moving toward the voice, toward the unknown. The woods closed in tighter with each step, as if the forest was guiding him, pushing him deeper into its heart. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. Mark felt himself tumbling, falling into darkness, his body crashing against something hard. His vision blurred, his senses spinning. For a moment, everything went silent. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself in a new place, an unfamiliar place. The trees were gone. The sky above him was nothing but a swirling mass of clouds, dark and thick, blocking out the sun. And all around him, in every direction, were shadows, figures that seemed to melt in and out of existence, watching him. Mark's throat tightened. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead. The whispers had returned, louder now, swirling around him like a swarm of bees, pressing against his skull. Leave now." Mark stumbled to his feet, his heart pounding, but the figures around him began to move, closing in slowly, silently, until he could feel their cold breath on his skin. He turned in a circle, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was nothing but darkness and the shadows that followed him. "Get out!" Mark's breath hitched as the shadows drew closer, their movements slow but deliberate. The whispers around him were growing louder, more frantic, as if the forest itself were urging him to leave, though there was no escape. He turned in circles, his heart pounding against his ribs, but no matter where he looked, the figures, those dark, shifting shapes, seemed to multiply. The air grew colder, and Mark could see his breath fogging in front of him. His legs were weak, his body trembling. He tried to move, to run, but his feet felt heavy, as though the ground itself was holding him in place. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward, its shape becoming clearer. A man, or at least something that resembled one. His face was obscured by a hood, the fabric hanging loosely, but what struck Mark was the way the man moved. He didn't walk. He glided, like he was floating just above the ground, his footsteps making no sound. As he drew closer, Mark could see the sharp outline of his features, pale and gaunt, the skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were deep, hollow, endless pits of blackness. Mark's throat went dry. The man didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to send a wave of dread crashing through Mark's chest. The man stopped just a few feet away, tilting his head as if studying Mark. The air around them thickened, the shadows pressing in from all sides. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears as he forced himself to speak. Who are you?" His voice came out cracked, barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it reached out a long, bony hand, the fingers ending in nails that were far too long, too sharp. Mark's breath caught as the hand hovered in the air between them, the skin of the man's hand pale, almost translucent and cold, as if it had never known warmth. Before Mark could react, the hand gently brushed his cheek, and a cold chill ran through him, like the touch of ice. A voice, low, gravelly, finally came, but it wasn't the man's voice. It was the voice of the forest, of everything that surrounded him. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered, its tone both a warning and a threat. Mark wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen, trapped in place by the suffocating air, the intense pull of the darkness that pressed in on all sides. "You are here," the voice continued, growing louder, "because you've been chosen." Chosen for what? Mark managed to croak, his voice barely audible. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to glow, flickering like dying embers. A slow, sinister smile spread across its face, and Mark felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. "Chosen to stay," it whispered. The shadows around them began to swirl, drawing closer, wrapping around Mark's body like tendrils of smoke. His heart raced, his breath shallow and ragged. He tried to pull away, but the shadows tightened, dragging him deeper into the forest, pulling him toward the figure. "No, no!" Mark gasped, struggling against the force that held him. "I just want to leave. I just want to go home." But the figure only watched, its smile widening, eyes gleaming with something that could only be described as hunger. "You cannot leave," it said, its voice now low and resonant, as if the words were spoken by the very earth beneath him. "The forest will not let you." Mark's mind spun. He was losing his grip on reality. The trees, the shadows, the whispers, they were all closing in on him. The air felt thick with something ancient and malevolent, like the forest itself was alive, hungry for him. "No," Mark gasped. "I know this isn't real. It can't be real." But even as the words left his mouth, the world around him began to warp. The shadows stretched, the trees twisted, and the ground beneath him shifted like soft clay. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps now, countless, dragging footsteps, all moving closer, all circling him. Figures began to emerge from the trees, just like the first one. Their forms bent, their eyes hollow and empty, staring at him with that same, soul-chilling gaze. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him now, echoing in his ears, in his mind. Stay with us." Mark's chest tightened. The forest was alive, not just in the way trees grow and animals move, but in a deeper, more terrifying sense. The forest was a place of hunger, of darkness, of souls trapped and forgotten, feeding on the living. And Mark, no matter how hard he struggled, was now one of them. "Please," his voice was barely a whisper, his mind growing numb. "Please, I just want to go back." "You are already here," the figure replied, its voice cold, empty. "You will never leave." Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Mark's head, like a searing fire, and his vision blurred. He dropped to his knees, clutching his skull as the voices roared in his ears, louder and more chaotic now, demanding his attention, drowning out everything else. The pain intensified, and Mark screamed, but no sound came out. His body trembled, his skin growing cold, his breath shallow and rapid. The darkness around him deepened, filling every inch of his senses, until he could no longer tell where he ended and the forest began. And then, everything went black. When Mark regained consciousness, it wasn't in the same place he had been. The forest was gone. The trees, the shadows, the whispering voices, they had all vanished, replaced by a strange, unnatural stillness. His mind was foggy, and his body felt heavy, as though it were made of lead. He blinked several times, trying to clear his vision, but the world around him was dark and indistinct. His senses slowly returned to him. The air was thick and stale, and the ground beneath him was uneven, cold and hard. Mark tried to push himself up, but his limbs felt weak, as though they were not his own. He could hear faint sounds in the distance, strange echoes that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Something was wrong. He couldn't place it, but a deep, primal part of him felt that he wasn't alone. He wasn't even sure where he was, but the sense of isolation pressed in on him like an iron weight. The darkness felt alive. It was oppressive, suffocating, as though the very fabric of reality had been twisted around him. Mark's heart thudded in his chest as he struggled to regain control of his body. With great effort, he pushed himself upright and stumbled forward, his feet dragging against the uneven ground. He took a few steps, and then suddenly the landscape around him shifted. The air grew colder, the shadows lengthened, and he could hear a faint, steady rhythm, like the sound of something large, something ancient, moving in the distance. The ground trembled beneath him, a low hum vibrating through his bones. Mark froze, his heart in his throat. Something was coming, something enormous. His thoughts raced as he tried to gather his bearings, but everything felt out of place. The world around him twisted, reconfiguring itself, as though he were caught in a nightmarish loop. He tried to scream, but his throat was dry, his voice swallowed by the thick air. "Where am I?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. But the words felt useless. The forest, or whatever this place was silent now, save for that rhythmic sound growing louder and louder. His legs shook, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he turned in every direction, desperate to find a way out. And then, through the darkness, he saw it. A shape, a figure, moving toward him through the blackness. It was huge, towering above him, but it was hard to make out any details. The darkness seemed to consume it, pulling at the edges of its form, making it shimmer like an illusion. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the figure came closer. It was humanoid in shape, but far too tall, its limbs long and unnaturally thin. Its face, if it could be called that, was an abyss, an empty void of blackness, like the forest itself had shaped the figure from the shadows. The air around it crackled with a low, guttural hum that made Mark's skin crawl. The creature's steps were slow, deliberate, each movement sending a wave of energy through the air. As it moved closer, Mark could feel its presence pressing down on him, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. The ground trembled with each of its footsteps, and Mark's legs gave way. He fell to the ground, his body trembling uncontrollably. The creature stopped just a few feet away. Mark could feel its gaze upon him, even though it had no eyes. It was as if the very fabric of the world was being pulled into its presence, the darkness around him thickening, suffocating him. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a sound that reverberated through Mark's mind. It was not a voice, not something he could understand, but the very essence of it cracked his thoughts wide open, like the force of a storm splitting a tree in half. "You belong here." The words were not spoken out loud, but they shook Mark's mind to its core. The creature seemed to radiate an ancient power, an oppressive force that wrapped around him like a shroud. It was everywhere now, surrounding him, suffocating him. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind on the edge of breaking. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs wouldn't obey him. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the presence of this monstrous being. It was as if the very air was thick with its will, and Mark was trapped, caught in its grip, unable to break free. "You will never leave," the voice inside his mind spoke again, the words slow and deliberate. Mark's chest tightened. Panic surged through him, his heart racing. This was it. He had been swallowed by the forest, consumed by something far beyond his understanding. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His breath became more erratic, his chest constricting. He was suffocating. The darkness, the creature, the whispers, they were all closing in, filling every inch of his mind. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed all the others before him. The figure moved closer, its long, impossibly thin fingers reaching toward him. Mark closed his eyes, desperate to block out the sight of it, but the darkness pressed in on him, suffocating him from all sides. "You are ours now." The fingers brushed his skin, icy cold, sending a shock of terror through his body. It was then that Mark realized the truth. There was no escaping this place. There was no running. The forest, the creatures, the endless darkness, they were part of it now. Part of him. And as the creature's touch seared through him, Mark felt his mind unraveling. The world spun out of control. The shadows, the whispers, the cold, they became his reality. The world he had known, the life he had lived, was nothing more than a distant memory now. He was no longer human. He was part of the forest, forever trapped, lost, and forgotten. The darkness closed in, and everything went silent. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Mark's consciousness drifted, his mind a fractured reflection of the world he had once known. He couldn't tell where the darkness began and where he ended. There was no sound, no movement, just an all-encompassing void that seemed to devour everything, including him. But then a flicker, a brief flash of light broke through the suffocating blackness, like a distant star flickering against the darkened sky. It was almost imperceptible at first, but it grew. The light began to spread, slow at first, then faster, washing over the darkness, pushing back the shadows, if only for a moment. Mark felt himself being pulled toward it, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. It was like a lifeline in the void, a sliver of hope cutting through the oppressive silence. He reached out, his hand trembling, desperate to grasp it, to escape the cold grip that had bound him so tightly. The light grew brighter, warmer, until it consumed him entirely. And then suddenly he was back. The forest, his surroundings, were gone. He was standing in a familiar place, a clearing bathed in the soft light of the afternoon sun. The ground beneath him was solid, the air warm and fresh. He looked around in confusion, his body still trembling from the terror he had just experienced. The forest should have been behind him. The trail, the very one that had led him to this nightmare, was gone. But something wasn't right. The clearing was too quiet, too still. Mark took a hesitant step forward, his breath shaky as he scanned the area. The trees around him seemed to loom, their branches stretching high into the sky. The faint rustle of leaves above was the only sound, yet even that felt wrong. The shadows beneath the trees stretched too far, too long. They moved in unnatural ways, as if they were alive, watching. He felt a shiver crawl up his spine, the sense of being watched, a presence lingering just beyond the edge of his vision. His stomach tightened, a gnawing unease growing inside him. It wasn't right. This place felt empty, like an illusion, a place he had been tricked into returning to. He glanced around, his eyes darting to the path that should have been before him. There was no path, only more trees, more shadows. And in the distance, barely perceptible but unmistakable, he saw a figure. It was far off, barely more than a silhouette against the trees, but it was there. A man, standing still, motionless, watching him. Mark's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized the figure. It was the man from before, the one who had led him deeper into the forest, the one who had spoken to him, warning him that he was too far gone to leave. The man in the dark coat. But now he was standing at the edge of the clearing, his face obscured by the same shadowy hood he had worn. He didn't move, just stared at Mark with that same cold, empty gaze that had haunted him since the moment they met. The air grew colder. Mark's feet were rooted to the ground, his body frozen with fear. The whispers began again, faint at first but slowly growing louder, swirling around him like a storm. They were familiar, those same distorted, unintelligible words that had filled his mind before. They began to make sense, as if the words were meant for him, as though the forest itself was speaking to him again. "Come closer," the whisper echoed, the voice inside his head. "Join us." Mark's breath quickened, his heart pounding as the whispers wrapped around him like chains, pulling him toward the man. "No," Mark whispered, but it was barely audible. His voice shook as he tried to take a step back. "No, I'm not." But before he could finish, the world around him shifted again, the clearing warping, the trees twisting and bending. The light seemed to fade, the shadows stretching toward him, reaching for him like hungry hands. The man's silhouette grew larger, towering over him now, his face still hidden in the darkness of the hood. "You've been here before," the man's voice echoed in Mark's mind, deep and slow, like the forest itself was speaking through him. "And you will always return." Mark's body screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. His eyes were locked on the figure, his thoughts a blur of fear and confusion. "No!" Mark shouted, finally breaking free from the grip of the shadows, his voice breaking. He stumbled backward, but the world was closing in again, the trees bending in on him, the whispers surrounding him once more. "You are one of us," the voice said again, its tone cold, final. "You always have been." Mark felt his vision blur, the edges of reality fraying as he was pulled deeper, deeper into the forest's grip. His breath came in ragged gasps as the world around him twisted and shifted. The trees were no longer trees. The shadows were no longer shadows. The forest was alive, breathing, consuming. And Mark was just another lost soul. Mark's body crumpled under the weight of the forest's power, his mind unraveling as the darkness closed in around him. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed whole by the vast, suffocating silence. The trees no longer stood as trees, but as endless walls, pressing in on him, folding him into the heart of the forest. The shadows shifted, writhed, and whispered, and Mark was no longer sure where he ended and they began. The man in the dark coat, the figure who had once been his guide, was now just another shadow in the endless sea of darkness, a part of the ancient, living force that claimed this place. His presence no longer mattered. Mark's struggle, his fear, they were all fading into nothingness, swallowed by the very forest that had brought him here. "You belong here," the voice echoed one last time, the words seeping into every corner of Mark's mind, filling the empty spaces where hope had once been. Forever, the ground beneath him gave way, and the last remnants of his consciousness were pulled into the void. The whispers, the darkness, the shadows, they all became one, and in that moment, Mark ceased to exist. His body, his soul, lost to the forest, forgotten by the world above. The path had claimed him, and just as it had for so many before, it would continue to change, to twist, and to lure the next unsuspecting wanderer deeper into its cold embrace. As the fog settles and the whispers fade, keep listening to the sound of rain. Let it wash over you and drift into a deep, peaceful sleep. Name of the next story, The Silent Lullaby. Every night, around 2:30 a.m., the soft strains of a lullaby would float through the house. It wasn't loud, just a quiet, haunting melody that seemed to come from the nursery. At first, Emily thought it was a trick of her tired mind. She had a baby now, and after all, being a mother brought its own share of sleepless nights and strange thoughts. But as the lullaby continued night after night, she began to wonder. The song wasn't one she recognized, and it didn't sound like a recording. It wasn't the baby's voice. It was too smooth, too serene. The melody was sweet, yet unnerving, like it had been sung for centuries. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again. The song echoed through the hallway, creeping into her room. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The baby was in the crib, safe and sound, she thought. But where was the voice coming from? It wasn't her baby. She glanced over at her husband, Jake, still asleep beside her, unaware. She rolled out of bed, slipping on her slippers, and walked quietly down the hallway. The song grew clearer as she approached the nursery. The door was cracked open just a little, and Emily paused. She didn't want to wake her baby, but the melody, there was something so strange about it, so off. It sounded almost too perfect. Taking a deep breath, she gently pushed the door open. Inside, the nursery was bathed in moonlight. Her baby, Charlie, was asleep in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling gently. The room was peaceful. The soft lullaby continued to float in the air, yet the baby's lips were still. Emily stood frozen in the doorway. Her heartbeat quickened, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. The song seemed to fill the room, weaving around her, and for a moment, she thought she felt it, something cold brushing against her skin. She stepped closer to the crib, her breath shallow, her hand gripping the doorframe as her eyes stayed fixed on Charlie. She leaned down, looking at her son's face. He was sound asleep, his chubby cheeks rosy under the soft light. He didn't appear to be singing, but the lullaby continued, clear as day. "Who's singing?" she whispered, her voice trembling, but the only response was the soft lullaby floating in the air, like a whisper from another time. Her hands trembled as she reached out to gently wake Jake. but the moment she turned, the song stopped. She froze. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then, just as quickly as it had stopped, it resumed. But now the song was slower, deeper, almost mournful. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Jake," she whispered, urgently, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up!" Jake stirred, groaning softly as he opened his eyes. "What's wrong?" "There's something in the nursery," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but—" Before she could finish, the lullaby stopped again, cutting through the silence like a knife. Jake sat up, confused and groggy. "What are you talking about?" "It's just the baby." But Emily's instincts told her otherwise. She looked at Jake, her eyes wide with fear. "No, it's not Charlie," she whispered. "It's not him singing. It's something else." Jake rubbed his eyes, still half asleep. It's probably just your mind playing tricks. You're exhausted." But Emily could see it in his eyes. He was starting to feel it too, the same creeping unease that had wormed its way into her chest. "Let's just go check," she insisted. Together, they stood and quietly walked down the hallway to the nursery. The door was open just like before, but this time, the room felt colder, unnaturally cold, as though the air had shifted somehow. Jake stepped forward and flicked on the light. The room was empty. "See," Jake said, trying to sound comforting, but Emily could see his face go pale as his gaze fell on the crib. Charlie was still asleep, but there, beside him, on the floor, was something else. A small, dark shape. Emily's blood ran cold. At first, she thought it was just a shadow, but then she saw it move. A small, delicate hand, dark as ink, slid across the floor. The shape was hunched over, not human, but something other. Something she couldn't comprehend. "Jake," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake turned, his face draining of color as he saw the thing. What is that?" Emily didn't know. She didn't know if it was some twisted illusion, some trick of the mind, or if it was real. But she knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here. Jake stepped forward slowly, but the thing scuttled away with alarming speed, retreating into the corner of the room where the shadows were thickest. Emily could feel her heart thudding in her chest as she backed away, instinctively shielding her baby. "What the hell was that?" Jake demanded, his voice shaking now. "I don't know," Emily whispered, "but I think it's been watching us." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The nursery seemed to grow colder, the silence pressing in, suffocating them. Then a soft sound broke the quiet, a whisper, barely audible, like someone singing in a language they didn't understand. It was the lullaby, but distorted now, twisted. The thing in the corner didn't move. It just waited, watching them. "We need to leave," Jake said urgently, grabbing Emily's arm. But Emily didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the corner, where the shape had vanished. "I don't think we can just leave," Emily said, her voice shaking. "We have to get Charlie out of here." She rushed to the crib and scooped up her son, clutching him to her chest. As she held him, she realized that the lullaby had stopped once more. The room was eerily still, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Jake stepped forward, his voice hoarse. "Emily, what is happening?" "I don't know," she said, "but I'm not staying here tonight." "Something's wrong, Jake. Something is very wrong." They turned to leave, but as they reached the door, the lullaby began again. This time it was louder, more insistent, as if it were calling them back. "I don't know how to explain this, but we can't just leave," Emily said, her voice breaking. "We have to face it." They both turned, fear rising like a tidal wave in their chests. The nursery was still, silent, but now, when Emily looked at the crib again, it wasn't just Charlie she saw. There was something else, small and shadowed, curling up next to him. A tiny face, pale and hollow-eyed, staring back at her. And that's when Emily understood. The lullaby wasn't just a song. It was a warning, a call, and the thing in the crib was waiting, watching. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she stood frozen in the doorway, Charlie still cradled in her arms. The tiny face in the crib, its hollow eyes and small, unnatural smile, stared back at her with an intensity that sent a chill through her entire body. The lullaby, now growing louder, filled the room with a disturbing melody, its sweetness twisted with an underlying malice. Jake's voice broke through her shock. "What the hell is that?" His words were strained, his eyes wide with terror. He reached for Emily, his hand shaking as he tried to pull her away from the crib. "No," she gasped, her voice barely audible. It's not Charlie. That thing, it's not real." Jake's face twisted with confusion and disbelief. "What do you mean it's not real? Emily, what are you saying? That's not our son in there." The lullaby swirled around them, hypnotic and unnerving. Emily felt as if the very air in the room had thickened, as if something was pressing down on her, weighing her down with a cold, suffocating force. She couldn't take her eyes off the thing in the crib. The pale face, the hollow eyes, it was wrong, so wrong. "It's not Charlie," Emily whispered again, her voice trembling. "But it looks like him. It's like something else pretending to be him." The small creature, if that's what it even was, shifted slightly, its dark eyes never leaving theirs. The movement was unnatural, jerky, almost as if it were learning how to mimic human gestures. Its tiny, twisted fingers curled and uncurled, its head tilting to one side as it observed them with an eerie, unsettling curiosity. Jake's face paled. "We have to get out of here, Emily. We have to." But before he could finish, the lullaby came to an abrupt stop, the silence crashing into the room like a tidal wave. Emily's pulse quickened, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she clutched Charlie tighter against her chest. The room felt colder now, colder than it had ever been, as if the warmth was being sucked out of it. She dared a glance at the crib again, and the small, pale figure was gone. "Where did it go?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the nursery, her eyes darting from the crib to the corners of the room. Jake stepped forward, his eyes wide. It's gone. What the hell is happening?" But Emily didn't hear him. Her gaze was fixed on the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather, growing darker, thicker, as if something was waiting in the dark. Her breath caught as she saw a shape move in the corner, a figure crouched and silent. It was too dark to make out its features, but Emily knew, without a doubt, that it was watching them. Her mind raced. She needed to get out. They needed to leave the house, get away from whatever this was before it was too late. "Jake, we need to go," she started, but her words died in her throat. The lullaby started up again, louder this time, filling the room with an overwhelming, almost suffocating presence. The song had become a dirge, its gentle melody now twisted into something sinister. It was no longer just a song, it was a summons, an invitation. And Emily felt herself being drawn back toward the crib, toward the thing that wasn't Charlie. "Emily!" Jake shouted, his voice breaking through her trance. He grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the crib, but she fought him off, her eyes wide with terror. "No! We can't leave. We can't leave him here," she cried, shaking. She turned to the crib, her gaze locked on the small shape that had returned, crouched at the edge of the mattress, staring at her with those empty, soulless eyes. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming. The song, it seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, from the very air around them. "Emily, we're leaving now," Jake said urgently, his grip tightening around her. But Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from the thing. It was wrong. It was so wrong. It looked like Charlie, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. And yet, the lullaby kept pulling her in, wrapping around her like a thick, suffocating veil. Suddenly, there was a soft creak behind them. Emily's heart skipped. She whipped around, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A tall woman. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her hair long and flowing, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes, black as midnight, fixed on Emily with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. Her lips parted, and she spoke, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "It's time. Emily's blood ran cold. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt like they were frozen to the floor. The woman's gaze seemed to hold her in place, trapping her in the nursery, the shadows pressing in from every side. "No, no, you're not real," Emily whispered, her voice shaking with terror. But the woman smiled. It was a slow, eerie smile, one that stretched far too wide. "Oh, I am real, dear. And so is the song. So is the lullaby. It's been waiting for you. Waiting for him." Emily turned to Jake, her voice frantic. "Jake, we have to get out now. Please, please." But Jake didn't respond. He was staring at the woman in the doorway, his expression blank, as if he couldn't see her, as if he didn't understand what was happening. "Jake, no!" Emily cried, but it was too late. The woman stepped forward, and with a single motion, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows swallowing them whole. In an instant, Emily felt herself falling, her vision spinning, and then everything went black. When Emily's vision returned, the first thing she noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, but a deep, oppressive quiet that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. The nursery was gone. In its place was a vast, empty space, stretching far beyond what her eyes could see. The walls had disappeared, leaving only shadows that seemed to shift and writhe around her. Charlie was no longer in her arms. She could feel the weight of him, his warmth, his soft breath gone. Her heart clenched in fear as she spun around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was alone. Alone in a place that didn't belong, a place that felt wrong. "Charlie!" she cried, her voice echoing unnervingly in the emptiness. There was no response, just the echo of her own voice, bouncing back at her from every direction. The shadows danced, flickering like candlelight, and she realized that she couldn't see the floor beneath her feet. It was as if she was floating in a void. The lullaby started again. It was faint at first, like the distant hum of a forgotten memory, but it grew louder, clearer, until it filled the space, wrapping around Emily like a cold shroud. Her heart raced as she followed the sound, her footsteps hesitant, her body shaking. It was coming from somewhere in the dark, from somewhere far ahead. She began walking, her legs weak, her mind screaming for her to turn back, but something deep within urged her forward. The lullaby called to her. It was familiar, yet foreign, sweet and twisted, like it was beckoning her closer to something or someone. The shadows seemed to shift with each step she took, their forms constantly changing, as if they were alive. There were shapes in the darkness, faces, hands, twisted bodies that lurked just beyond the edges of her vision. They whispered, their voices soft and unintelligible, but the words felt like nails scraping against her skin. "Charlie," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" The lullaby swirled around her, louder now, almost deafening. And then she heard a voice. It wasn't Jake's, it wasn't her own. It was something else. "Mommy," the voice whispered, a soft, childlike voice that sounded so familiar and yet so wrong. "Charlie?" Emily's heart leapt in her chest, and she turned desperately in the direction of the voice. "Charlie, is that you?" But as she looked around, she saw only darkness. The voice had disappeared, leaving behind only the echo of her own thoughts. The lullaby continued, and Emily began to walk faster, her fear growing with each passing second. She had to find him. She had to get out of this place. The shadows pressed closer, and the air felt thicker, as though it was suffocating her. Then, just as she thought she couldn't take another step, she saw it. A faint light in the distance, flickering like a star in the void. She hurried toward it, her heart pounding, praying that it would lead her to Charlie. As she approached the light, the shadows around her grew more dense, more aggressive. They clawed at her, reaching for her, but she pushed forward, ignoring the cold tendrils that scraped at her skin. And then she saw it. The crib. It was placed in the center of the light, surrounded by darkness that couldn't quite reach it. Her heart leapt as she rushed forward, her breath ragged in her chest. "Charlie," she gasped, falling to her knees beside the crib. But it wasn't Charlie who lay there. It was the pale, twisted thing that had been in the nursery, its tiny, hollow eyes staring up at her. The lullaby was louder now, almost deafening, and the thing in the crib began to shift, its fingers twitching, reaching out toward Emily. Its mouth opened slowly, and in a voice that sounded too young and yet too old, it spoke. "Mommy," it whispered. "I've been waiting." Emily recoiled, her chest tight with terror. This thing, it wasn't Charlie. It couldn't be. But it had his voice, his eyes. Everything about it was wrong. "Where's my baby? Where is Charlie?" Emily cried, her voice breaking. The thing in the crib smiled, its grin widening impossibly wide, the edges of its mouth stretching far too far. Its face twisted into something unrecognizable, as if it were unraveling, its features warping with each passing second. "He's gone, Mommy," it whispered. "He's gone, and now you're here, with me." Emily's blood ran cold as the thing began to rise from the crib, its movements jerky, unnatural. It wasn't a baby anymore, not in any sense she could understand. It was something else, something that had taken Charlie's place, something that had always been waiting for her. "No!" Emily shouted, stumbling back, her hands shaking. "No, you're not him. You're not my baby." The thing reached out, its long, dark fingers curling toward her, and Emily knew in that moment that it wasn't just the baby that was lost. The whole house, the whole world was wrong. The lullaby wasn't a song. It was a curse, a trap, pulling her into a nightmare she couldn't escape. She turned to run, her mind racing, her legs weak, but the shadows had grown stronger, closing in around her like a vice. The lullaby followed her, its haunting melody filling her ears, drowning out everything else. She could hear the thing behind her, its footsteps growing closer, its voice calling out to her with every step. "Mommy, stay with me." The voice wasn't just in her ears, it was in her mind, wrapping around her thoughts, twisting them, turning them into something dark, something that didn't belong. And then she saw it, her baby's face just ahead, his eyes wide and innocent, calling to her. But when she reached out to him, she realized that it wasn't Charlie at all. It was another illusion, another lie. She couldn't escape. The shadows had her now. The lullaby had claimed her. And as the darkness closed in, the last thing Emily heard was the whispering voice of the thing in the crib. "Mommy, forever." The darkness consumed her, pulling her into a suffocating abyss. Emily's lungs burned as she gasped for air, but there was none to be found. Her body felt weightless, floating in a space that was both empty and full at once, an endless, oppressive void where time had no meaning. The lullaby continued to echo, its melody like a thread, pulling her deeper, farther from anything familiar. It wrapped around her, weaving through her thoughts, until she couldn't tell where she ended and it began. Her mind felt fractured, her memories slipping away, replaced by the haunting song and the hollow, twisted face of the thing in the crib. And then, as if in response to her terror, the void gave way. She was no longer floating, no longer suspended in nothingness. She was back in the nursery, the same nursery she had left behind moments, or was it hours, ago. Everything was the same, yet nothing felt right. The walls were too close, the air too thick. The shadows in the corners moved with a life of their own, twisting and curling, always watching. Emily blinked, her head pounding, her body aching as if it had been pulled through some otherworldly realm. She looked around desperately, searching for Charlie, but the crib was empty. And then she heard it, the soft sound of a lullaby, coming from the corner of the room. A familiar, haunting melody that made her blood run cold. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. She had to get out. She had to. The lullaby stopped abruptly, and in the silence that followed, Emily could feel something shift. Something had changed. Suddenly, a soft whisper floated to her ears, its voice familiar yet foreign, like a distant memory. "Mommy!" Her heart raced, the sound of her baby's voice sending a shudder through her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows grew darker, the room shrinking, the air growing heavier. The voice came again, only this time it was closer. Right behind her. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Mommy," the voice said again, but it was no longer Charlie's voice. It was wrong, too deep, too old. It carried with it an unnatural echo, like something far too ancient and malevolent to belong in her world. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with fear, and there, in the far corner of the room, stood a figure. A woman with long, flowing hair and a face pale as death. Her eyes were black, empty, voids that seemed to draw in all light. She smiled, her lips curling in a way that made Emily's stomach twist. "Who are you?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman's smile widened, her teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice sweet and sickening like the lullaby. "For so long." Emily took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The woman's laugh was soft, almost melodic, but it sent a chill down Emily's spine. "I don't want anything from you, dear. You're already mine." Before Emily could react, the woman moved, impossibly fast, closing the distance between them in an instant. Her cold hand reached out and grasped Emily's arm, holding her in place with an iron grip. "You've already been chosen," the woman whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "This house, this curse, it's all part of the plan. And now, you will stay with us, forever." Emily struggled, her pulse racing, but the woman's grip only tightened. "No! Let me go!" she cried, panic rising in her chest. But the woman only smiled. "There is no escape," she said softly. "There never was." Suddenly, the room began to shift again, the walls stretching, warping, and twisting around them. The shadows deepened, the air thick with an almost tangible sense of dread. And then Emily felt it, something cold, sharp, like fingers brushing against the back of her neck. She whipped around, and there, in the doorway, stood Charlie. But this wasn't Charlie. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow, staring at her with an emptiness that sent a wave of terror through her. His tiny fingers curled, reaching out toward her with an unnatural hunger. "Mommy," he whispered, but it wasn't his voice. It was the same voice that had haunted her in the dark, the voice of something old, something evil. "No," Emily breathed, taking a step back. "No, Charlie, you're not him. You're not my baby." Charlie's lips twisted into a grin, his face warping, as if the very act of smiling was tearing him apart. His small body jerked unnaturally, and Emily could see it now. His limbs weren't the soft, delicate ones of an infant. They were long, twisted, and unnaturally thin. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes, those dark, empty eyes, they never blinked. The woman behind Emily laughed softly, her fingers digging into her arm. "Don't you see? He is here. He always was. And now so are you." Emily's heart stopped. She couldn't breathe. She could only stare at Charlie, or whatever he had become. His head tilted to one side, his expression twisted in that sickening, unnatural way, and he took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The lullaby began again, louder now, filling the room with its maddening melody. Emily felt the walls closing in on her, the air growing thin, suffocating. The shadows twisted around her, pressing against her skin, crawling under her clothes. "Charlie," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please don't, please." The thing that had once been her son reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, and as it touched her skin, she felt a sharp, searing pain. A cold that spread from her arm into her chest, into her soul. The shadows in the room seemed to dance, their shapes growing more solid, more real, as if they were alive, closing in around her. The walls seemed to collapse, the room shrinking, until all Emily could see was Charlie's face, his twisted, unrecognizable face, staring at her with those empty eyes. And then, in one final moment of clarity, she understood. She wasn't meant to escape. There was no escape. She had been drawn in, chosen, and now she was a part of it, part of the curse, part of the lullaby. And as the last of her breath left her, the lullaby swirled around her, and she too became one with the shadows, fading into the endless dark. Forever. Name of the next story: The Lady in the Window. The first few weeks in the new apartment had been everything Rachel and Ben had hoped for. It was small, cozy, and affordable, nestled in a quiet corner of the city. The building was old, but it had charm, creaky floors, big windows, and the kind of warmth you could only get from a place with a history. It wasn't a fancy high-rise, but that's exactly what they liked about it. It felt homey. And of course there was the view. From their living room window, they had a perfect view of the apartment complex across the street, an older building with a slightly faded facade and overgrown ivy creeping up the walls. It wasn't anything remarkable at first glance, but there was something about it that intrigued Rachel. It was one of those things that felt like a little puzzle, the kind of thing you find yourself noticing without really thinking about it, like the way the light hit the windows in the morning, or how the wind rustled the ivy late at night. But then came the woman in the window. It started on a Thursday evening. Rachel had just finished making dinner, and Ben was sitting on the couch, his laptop open in front of him. She walked over to the window, as she often did, to look out at the street below. It was quiet, the kind of evening where the world felt still and empty. But when she looked at the building across from them, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. A figure, standing motionless in the window of the apartment on the top floor. At first, Rachel assumed it was just another person in the building, someone who was still awake, maybe reading or staring out into the city. But as she kept her gaze fixed on the window, she realized that the figure wasn't moving at all. She squinted, trying to make out the details. The person was a woman, or at least seemed to be. She had long, dark hair that fell in waves down her back, and she was dressed in a plain, dark-colored blouse. But what struck Rachel was the way the woman stood. She was still, almost unnaturally so, her gaze locked straight ahead. The woman didn't seem to be looking at anything in particular, just staring out into the night. Rachel frowned. It was odd, yes, but not exactly unsettling. People often stared out their windows late at night, right? Ben, she called over her shoulder. Do you see that woman across the street? The one in the window. Ben glanced up from his laptop and peered over at the building. What? The one on the top floor? Yeah, I see her. Rachel narrowed her eyes, still watching the woman. She's been standing there for a while now. Don't you think that's kind of strange? Ben shrugged. Maybe she's just zoning out or something. People get like that sometimes. Rachel didn't respond, but she couldn't shake the odd feeling that had settled in her chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like curiosity, mixed with a sense of unease. She couldn't help but stare at the woman, wondering what she was doing, what she was thinking. But after a few minutes, the woman turned and disappeared from the window, leaving Rachel with nothing but a vague sense of discomfort. The next night, it happened again. Rachel and Ben had just finished watching a movie, and once again, Rachel found herself drawn to the window. She hadn't expected to see anything unusual, but there, in the top floor window of the building across the street, was the same woman. She stood motionless in the same spot, staring out into the darkness. Rachel froze, her heart thudding in her chest. The woman's face was expressionless, but her eyes were fixed on something distant. It was like she wasn't even aware that Rachel was watching her, or maybe she didn't care. But this time, something felt different. This time, the woman wasn't just standing there. She was waiting. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know why, but she felt a sudden compulsion to know more. Who was she? Why did she stand there, night after night, in the same spot, looking out at the same empty street? But it wasn't just the woman's stillness that unnerved Rachel. It was the feeling that came over her when she looked at her. A strange sensation, like being pulled into something she wasn't meant to understand. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, and the night outside suddenly felt colder, darker. "Ben," Rachel whispered, not taking her eyes off the window. "I think something's wrong with that woman." Ben, who had been half watching her from the couch, looked up again. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. I feel like she's watching me back, like she's waiting for something." Ben chuckled, trying to shake off the tension. "You're just imagining things. It's probably nothing." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling. She kept her eyes trained on the window, unwilling to look away, as if doing so would somehow break the spell. It was as if the woman was drawing her in. The next night, the same thing happened. And the next. Every night, without fail, the woman appeared in the same spot in the window, staring out motionless, as if frozen in time. Rachel began to notice other details about the woman, little things that sent chills up her spine. The way her hair was always perfect, no matter the time of night. The way her clothes looked, too neat, too still, as though she had never moved. Rachel couldn't help herself. She began to watch the woman every night. And every night, the woman never moved. She never blinked, never turned her head, just stood there, staring out at the world as if she were trapped in a moment that would never end. One evening, Rachel mentioned the woman to a neighbor in the building. Mrs. Lowry, an older woman who lived on the floor above them, had lived in the building for years and knew all the gossip. Rachel figured she might know something about the woman. "Do you know who lives in that building across the street?" Rachel asked as they bumped into each other in the hallway. Mrs. Lowry adjusted her glasses, eyeing Rachel with a look of interest. "Oh, that old place? Sure, I know it. It's been there forever." Rachel nodded. "I'm talking about the woman on the top floor, the one who always stares out the window at night." Mrs. Lowry's expression changed, and her lips tightened into a thin line. "You're talking about Eleanor." "Eleanor?" "Yeah, Eleanor Clark. She used to live there, a long time ago, but she passed away years ago. It's been about, I'd say a decade now." Rachel blinked, taken aback. "Passed away? But I've been seeing her every night in that window. She's alive. I can see her clearly." Mrs. Lowry's eyes darkened, and she took a step closer to Rachel, her voice dropping to a whisper. "No, dear. She's not alive. She died, and she's still there, because she never left. Some souls don't." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Lowry shook her head, her face filled with a kind of sorrow. "It's a curse. Eleanor was, she had her secrets. She was never a good person. They say she was waiting for something, even when she died. And now she's still waiting." Rachel's heart raced. The room felt colder, darker. Waiting for what? Mrs. Lowry didn't answer right away. She just gave Rachel one last, lingering look, then turned and walked away without another word. Rachel stood frozen in the hallway, her mind reeling from what she had just learned. Eleanor Clark had been dead for years, yet every night she appeared in that window, staring out into the night as if she were waiting for someone. As Rachel stood there, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from Ben. "Where are you? Come back to the apartment. Something's wrong." She felt a sudden jolt of fear. Something was wrong, indeed. And Rachel knew she had to find out what. She had to know what Eleanor was waiting for. Rachel's fingers trembled as she quickly typed back a reply to Ben. "I'm on my way." She wasn't sure why, but her heart pounded in her chest, the air around her thick with something unspoken. She made her way back to the apartment as quickly as she could, the unsettling conversation with Mrs. Lowry replaying in her mind over and over. She's not alive. She's waiting for something. What did it mean? How could Eleanor still be there, in that window, when she had died years ago? And if she was still there, why was she waiting? Rachel pushed the door open to their apartment, her eyes immediately darting to the living room window. The building across the street stood eerily still, but she didn't see Eleanor in the window this time. The silence was thick, and a coldness seemed to have settled over the apartment. Ben was standing in the middle of the room, his face pale, his eyes wide with alarm. "Rachel," he said, his voice strained. I don't know what's happening. I'm hearing things." Rachel walked over to him, her own heartbeat quickening. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "I keep hearing noises," Ben explained, his voice shaking, like whispering, "but no one's here. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but then it started to sound like someone was calling my name. Softly, like a voice in the dark." Rachel's throat went dry. The whispers. She had heard them too, hadn't she? Just faint echoes that she couldn't quite place, like soft murmurs that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the walls of their apartment. "Ben, listen to me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That woman across the street, Eleanor, she's dead. She's been dead for years." Ben furrowed his brow, confused. "What are you talking about? I've seen her too. She's been standing there every night, staring out the window." "No, Ben." Rachel's voice was firm now, despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "She's not alive. She passed away years ago. Mrs. Lowry told me. She's been dead for a long time. But she's still there, in that window. And she's waiting for something she never got." Ben stared at her, his face pale. "But how? How can that be possible?" "I don't know," Rachel whispered. "But we need to find out what's going on. I have to know why she's still there." Ben's eyes flickered nervously toward the window across the street. "What do we do?" Rachel's mind raced, and for the first time, she had an idea. It was dangerous, reckless even, but there was no other choice. If they wanted answers, they had to confront whatever was going on. "I'm going to that building," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben's eyes widened. "You can't. You don't know what's—" "I have to, Ben," she interrupted, cutting him off. "She's been there for years. If something's keeping her there, I have to find out what it is. Maybe it'll stop if we know what she's waiting for." Ben's expression darkened, but after a moment, he sighed and nodded. "Okay, but we stick together. We're not going in there alone." Rachel agreed, and the two of them quickly gathered what they needed: flashlights, a couple of cell phones, and the courage to face whatever lay across the street in that old, decaying building. The walk across the street felt like it took forever. The closer they got, the heavier the air became. The building loomed ahead of them, its faded walls and overgrown ivy casting long shadows in the dim light. Rachel's pulse thudded in her ears as she climbed the front steps, the creaky wooden porch groaning beneath her weight. The door to the building was old, weathered, and unlocked. Rachel pushed it open, and the sound of it creaking echoed through the empty hallway. The smell of dust and decay filled her nostrils, the air stale and still. They stepped inside, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. It felt like the building was holding its breath, like everything inside was waiting. The silence was almost unbearable, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes your skin crawl. "Where's the apartment?" Ben asked in a whisper, his voice tense. "The top floor," Rachel replied, her eyes scanning the hallway. "It's the same place she's been standing in every night." The top floor window. They began to climb the staircase, each step creaking beneath their feet. The higher they climbed, the darker the building seemed to get. The walls, once painted a light cream color, were now chipped and peeling, the wallpaper faded and torn in places. The hallway on each floor looked eerily similar, narrow, cramped, and empty. It felt like they were the only ones left in the building, like it had been abandoned for years, even though it wasn't. When they reached the top floor, they found the hallway stretched before them, lined with doors that looked like they hadn't been opened in ages. Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine as she approached the door to the apartment across from theirs. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had left it open just a crack, waiting for them to step inside. "This is it," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. They both paused before stepping over the threshold. Inside, the apartment was just as it had been across the street, dark, with only a small amount of light from the moon streaming in through the dusty windows. The air in here felt cold, colder than it had any right to be. Rachel turned to Ben. She was here. She's been here. Ben didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the window. And there she was, the woman, Eleanor. She stood, just as she always had, staring out the window. But now Rachel could see her more clearly than ever before. Her long, dark hair was tangled, her face pale and thin, almost sickly. Her clothes were tattered, her blouse torn in places as though it had been worn for years. And her eyes were different. They were no longer vacant. They were filled with something dark and angry. A feeling that chilled Rachel to the bone. "Eleanor?" Rachel whispered, stepping toward her. For a moment, the woman didn't move. She didn't acknowledge them. She just stared out into the night, her face frozen in a vacant expression. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Eleanor turned her head toward them. Her eyes locked onto Rachel's, and the room seemed to grow colder. "I've been waiting," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "Waiting for what?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. Eleanor smiled, a twisted, eerie grin that sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. "For you." Rachel's breath hitched in her throat. The room seemed to close in around her as Eleanor's gaze remained locked onto her. It wasn't the look of a person. It was something far darker, something far older. Rachel's pulse quickened as the temperature in the room dropped even further, and she felt a chill that gnawed at her bones. Ben took a step back, his face pale and wide-eyed, as if he had just realized the magnitude of what was happening. What does she mean?" he whispered, barely able to speak. Rachel couldn't take her eyes off Eleanor. The woman's expression twisted into something malevolent, something that sent a shudder through her spine. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate step forward, her bare feet silent against the floor. The apartment was silent except for the whispering voice that seemed to reverberate in Rachel's skull. "I've been waiting for years," Eleanor whispered again, her voice growing louder, more insistent, as though it were coming from every direction at once. "You should have never come here. You should have never come for me." Rachel's heart raced as she took an involuntary step back. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice wavered. "Why are you here? Why are you in that window every night?" Eleanor's lips curled into a dark smile. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen around her, stretching unnaturally. Her figure grew slightly blurry, flickering like a bad television signal, but then snapped back into focus, her eyes never leaving Rachel's. "I never left," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "You think you can escape? You think you can just walk away from me? You can't. Not now. Not when you've seen me. Not when I've seen you." Rachel's legs felt like they were made of stone, but she forced herself to move. She glanced at Ben, who stood frozen, a look of pure terror on his face. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. "We need to leave. Now." But as she turned to run, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Rachel screamed, stumbling back as the walls seemed to close in on them. The apartment's once familiar surroundings felt distorted now, twisted. The windows were no longer just windows. They were like eyes watching, waiting. The whispers had returned. They filled the room now, louder than before, swirling around them, tugging at their sanity. "You cannot leave," Eleanor's voice echoed, louder than before, a cacophony of dread. "You're part of this now. You're part of my waiting." Ben's breath came in shallow gasps. "What does she want from us?" he asked, his voice barely audible. His hand was trembling in Rachel's, his body shaking. Rachel didn't have an answer. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But all she could do was stare at the woman, Eleanor, who was now slowly moving toward them, her feet dragging like she had all the time in the world. The air grew heavier, thick with an unnatural force. The shadows in the room writhed like living things, stretching toward them, pulling them in. Rachel tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. The lock refused to turn. The handle felt as though it were welded in place. Panic rose in her chest. She was trapped. Ben's voice trembled. "There has to be a way out. There has to be. But before he could finish, the lights flickered once, then went out completely. They were plunged into complete darkness. The only sound in the room was the growing hiss of the whispers, now coming from all directions. Rachel could feel them on her skin, crawling under her clothes, pressing into her thoughts. And then, through the darkness, a low, guttural laugh echoed. Eleanor's laugh. It filled every corner of the room, reverberating in their bones, sinking into their minds. "Help!" Rachel screamed, her voice desperate. "Someone! Please!" But no one came. For a moment, there was silence. And then, Eleanor's figure appeared in the darkness, her face pale and stretched, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her grin grew wider as she took another step closer. "You think you can escape me?" she hissed. "You're wrong. I've been waiting for you. For so long." Rachel felt a wave of nausea sweep over her as Eleanor's presence loomed over them, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She could see it now, the truth behind the woman's haunting stare. Eleanor was not just a lost soul. She was a prisoner, trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead, forever caught in a cycle of waiting, of longing for something, someone, that would never come. And now Rachel and Ben were a part of it. They had stepped into her world, into her curse. There was no going back. Ben finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from us?" Eleanor's smile twisted again, her mouth opening wide in a grotesque grin. "I want everything." Rachel's eyes widened as she saw the shadows shift around them, growing darker, taking on form. Figures, shapeless, human-like, began to materialize in the corners of the room. They moved slowly, like shadows that were trying to reach them, their presence suffocating. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she saw the figures' faces, pale, drawn faces, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They were people who had been waiting too, waiting just like Eleanor. "They were like you," Eleanor whispered, her voice cold. "They came to find out the truth just like you. But now they're mine. Forever." Rachel stumbled backward, her legs unsteady as the figures continued to gather around them. The room seemed to stretch impossibly long, the shadows growing and merging together. The coldness wrapped around her like a vice, suffocating, unrelenting. "No," she gasped, her mind racing for a solution. "We can't be a part of this. We can't." The figures stepped closer, their eyes empty and hungry. Eleanor's laugh echoed through the room, and Rachel's heart sank. It was too late. They were already part of the curse. And now they would never escape. Ben's voice shook with fear. "We're not leaving, are we?" "No," Rachel whispered, tears burning in her eyes. "We're not." Eleanor's smile widened as she stepped forward. "Welcome to your waiting," she said, her voice low and final. "You'll be just like them, waiting forever." And then the room fell silent once more. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick with the presence of the figures surrounding them. Rachel could feel her pulse thrumming in her ears, each beat a reminder of how desperately trapped she and Ben were. The shadows stretched across the room, swallowing everything, until it seemed like there was nothing left but darkness and the cold breath of the spirits who surrounded them. Rachel glanced at Ben, who stood frozen beside her, his eyes wide with terror. She could see his lips moving, forming words, but no sound came out. It was like they were in a vacuum, a place where nothing but the whispers of the dead could exist. Eleanor was still standing there, just out of reach, but her presence filled the space completely. Her eyes, once hollow and vacant, now seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity. The smile on her face twisted, pulling at the skin of her cheeks until Rachel thought it might tear apart. The figures around them shuffled closer, their movements slow and deliberate. Each step they took echoed in the silence, the sound unsettling in its quietness. Their faces were ghostly pale, their eyes wide and unblinking, but there was something familiar about them, something deeply unsettling. Rachel's heart pounded harder, her mind racing. There had to be something she could do. She refused to believe that this was the end. Not like this. She grabbed Ben's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. His eyes met hers, panic etched on his face, but there was something else, something buried deep in his gaze. It was the same recognition that had struck Rachel when she first saw the faces in the dark, the sense that they weren't just strangers. They were like them. They were like us, Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Ben looked at her, confusion and fear mixing in his eyes. What are you talking about? The realization hit Rachel like a thunderclap. The figures, they weren't just random spirits. They were people who had once been alive, just like her and Ben. They were living souls who had been pulled into this place. This apartment, the same apartment that had trapped them now. The curse wasn't just in the building, it was in the people who lived here. It was something that had started long before they moved in. Eleanor wasn't just a ghost, she was a keeper of souls, cursed to watch over the lost ones who were drawn into her world, pulled into her waiting forever. Rachel's throat tightened. Ben, we have to break the curse, she said, her voice urgent. We have to stop this. But how? Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's laugh cut through the air again, harsh and jagged, like 1,000 broken pieces of glass scraping together. You cannot break what is already broken, she hissed. Her eyes glinted with an unsettling light as she stepped forward, the shadows retreating in response. Rachel tried to steady her breath. There had to be a way out. There had to be something she could do. She had to fight back, to find a way to free them from this nightmare. But as she stood there, the weight of the room pressing down on her, a strange feeling washed over her. The whispers had stopped. The shadows that had once seemed alive with movement froze, as if waiting for something. The cold air in the room thickened, and Rachel could feel it. Something ancient and powerful was stirring. I've been waiting, Eleanor whispered, her voice softer now, but still carrying a weight of finality. Waiting for you to understand. You were always meant to be here. You've always been a part of this place. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. No, that's not true. We're not part of this. We were just... No, Eleanor cut in, her voice sharp. You are part of it. You are here because you belong here. Just like the others before you, just like everyone who's ever come to this place. You've always been here waiting. You were drawn in. Ben shook his head, confusion clouding his features. This isn't real. This can't be real. Oh, it's real, Eleanor replied, her smile growing wider, stretching unnaturally. This is realer than anything you've ever known. You think you can escape? You can't. You're already lost. Rachel stumbled back, her knees weakening. Her mind raced, but the room felt impossibly small. The walls were closing in on her. Every breath felt like it could be her last. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something. A faint glimmer in the shadows, a reflection from the far wall. A picture frame hanging crookedly near the door, covered in dust. The glass was cracked, but what caught Rachel's attention wasn't the frame. It was what was inside. It was a picture of the apartment building, just like it was now. Old, worn down, decaying. But the faces in the window weren't Eleanor's. They were familiar. Familiar. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing. There in the glass were the faces of the people who had been lost. The ones who had once lived here. But there was something else, something even more chilling. Among them was a face she recognized, her own. The picture seemed to warp and twist, the faces of the lost souls shifting. Rachel's heart lurched as the truth began to unravel before her. She had always been a part of this. Not just her and Ben, but everyone who had ever come here. This was no ordinary building. This wasn't just a haunted apartment. It was a prison, a place where the living and the dead were intertwined, and once you set foot inside, you became a part of it, a part of the curse, trapped, waiting. And Rachel realized then, in that moment of terrible clarity, that the only way out was to never leave. The room seemed to darken even further, the walls closing in, the shadows growing like an ocean of despair. The whispers began again, louder now, swirling around her, drowning her in their mournful sound. They weren't just whispers. They were the voices of those who had come before her. The voices of the trapped. The door opened behind them, the faintest of light spilling through, and Rachel turned toward it. But it wasn't salvation. It was just more waiting. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest as she turned towards the open door, her body frozen in terror. The light spilling through the crack in the door was not a welcoming sight. It wasn't the relief she had imagined. It was something else, something far worse. The door didn't lead out into the hallway as it should have. It led into another room, a room she knew she had never seen before. It was like a mirror image of the apartment they had been living in, but everything was off. The furniture was draped in white sheets, and the room was bathed in a sickly, dim light that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. It felt wrong. Rachel's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she looked back at Ben, whose face was pale with fear. He was staring at the door, his eyes wide in disbelief. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible. That door, it wasn't there before." I don't know," Rachel murmured, her voice trembling. She couldn't take her eyes off the door. It beckoned to them, drawing them closer, but Rachel had a horrible feeling that crossing that threshold would seal their fate forever. Before she could speak, Eleanor's voice slithered through the air, cold and malicious. "Don't look away," she whispered, the words a hiss that wrapped around them like a cold chain. "You can never escape. Not from me. Not from this." Rachel turned back to see Eleanor standing at the edge of the room, her form flickering like a broken film reel. Her eyes were wide and vacant, and the twisted grin on her face stretched impossibly far, as if her face was tearing apart. But it wasn't just her face that terrified Rachel. It was the shadows surrounding her, shadows that didn't belong to her, shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. They coiled and shifted, their shapes almost human. Almost. Ben's voice trembled as he spoke, his words barely audible. What is she? What do you want from us?" Eleanor's eyes flickered toward him, her grin widening even further. "I told you," she said softly, her voice reverberating in the air. "You were always meant to be here." Rachel's stomach twisted in horror as the air around her seemed to thicken, pressing down on her with a weight so heavy that she felt as though she couldn't breathe. The shadows swirled around the room, tightening their grip on the walls. The temperature dropped so sharply that she could see her breath forming in the air, visible in the freezing cold that had settled around them. "What did we do to deserve this?" Ben whispered, his voice filled with disbelief and dread. "We just moved here. We didn't know." Eleanor laughed, a low, sinister sound that echoed in the room like a death rattle. "You didn't have to know. You were chosen," she said, her voice turning sweet and mocking. "Chosen to join the others. To wait." Rachel felt her stomach churn. The air was thick with something else now. Something she couldn't explain. A creeping sense of inevitability settled in her bones, and she felt herself being drawn toward the door. It was as if the room was no longer just a room. It was a labyrinth, shifting and changing as they moved, each step leading them further into the waiting. But there was no way out. Ben reached for her hand, his fingers trembling as he gripped hers tightly. "We need to get out of here. We need to find a way to break this, break whatever curse this is," he said desperately. Rachel nodded, but even as she spoke, she knew the truth. There was no way to break this curse. No way to leave this place. No way to undo the pull that had drawn them in. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "You think you can leave? You think you can escape?" she taunted, stepping forward, her form flickering in and out of focus. "You've already crossed the line. There's no going back. You belong here. You belong to me." Rachel wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. It was as though she was rooted to the spot, her legs heavy, her mind clouded with fear. The room around them seemed to spin, the walls warping and contorting, and then, just as suddenly as it began, everything froze. The shadows stopped moving. The whispers ceased. The air grew thick with silence. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat as she realized what was happening. It wasn't just the room that had changed. It was them. She and Ben had become part of the apartment. They had become part of Eleanor's world, trapped in a never-ending loop of waiting. She could feel it now, the pull in her chest, the desire to stay, to belong. It was as if the building itself was alive, feeding on her fear, on her desperation. "Please," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, we just want to leave." But the words felt hollow, empty. The apartment was no longer a place. It was a trap. The walls had ears. The floors had eyes. Eleanor's form loomed closer, her smile widening impossibly. She was inches away now, her breath cold against Rachel's skin. "It's too late for you," she whispered, her voice a sing-song melody that sent chills through Rachel's bones. "You've crossed the threshold. You've been marked. You are mine." Rachel's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her head spinning. She wanted to scream, but the sound never came. The walls were closing in. The shadows were reaching out for them, curling like fingers, pulling them in. Ben fell beside her, his hand grasping hers tightly. "No, Rachel," he whispered, his voice raw with fear. "Don't give up. We can't give up. There has to be a way." Rachel shook her head weakly. "There isn't," she whispered back, her voice almost drowned by the growing hum of the whispers. "We're part of it now. We're part of the waiting." The whispers grew louder. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, as if the building itself were alive and breathing. The air grew colder still, and Rachel could see her breath coming in foggy puffs. Then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything stopped. The shadows, the whispers, Eleanor. It was gone. Rachel blinked in confusion, her heart still racing in her chest. She felt like she had just been trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of what had just happened. Had they escaped? But the apartment was still there, still the same. The door stood wide open now, revealing the hallway beyond. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Was it over? Could they leave? But as she turned to look at Ben, her breath caught in her throat. He wasn't there. The room was empty. Rachel's chest tightened as she looked around, her voice trembling. "Ben," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ben, where are you?" There was no answer. Rachel felt a wave of panic sweep over her. She was alone. And then she saw it. In the distance, through the open door, she saw the figure standing in the hallway. Eleanor. And in her arms, a small bundle. Rachel's heart stopped. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. Rachel's blood ran cold as she stared at the figure in the hallway. Eleanor stood there, just beyond the threshold of the apartment, her eyes glowing in the dim light. In her arms was something, no, someone. The figure was small, wrapped in a blanket, its form almost too perfect, too still. It was like a child, but it wasn't just any child. It was the same child Rachel had seen in the picture, the same child she had glimpsed in the reflection of the cracked glass. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The child, the baby in Eleanor's arms, was Ben. "Ben," she whispered, but the word barely made it past her lips, drowned out by the pounding of her heart. Eleanor's lips twisted into a smile, sickly sweet and cruel, as she rocked the bundle gently in her arms. The room seemed to grow even colder, the shadows creeping further into the corners of the apartment, as if drawn to the figure in the doorway. "Don't you see, Rachel?" Eleanor's voice was soft, almost melodic, but there was an underlying venom to it. "You were never meant to be here, not like this. But he was always meant to be part of this place. He was always mine." Rachel took a step back, panic clawing at her throat. "No, you don't understand. Ben, he's alive. He's here with me." But Eleanor just shook her head slowly, her smile never fading. "Not anymore," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "He's already gone. And now he's with me." Rachel's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the overwhelming, suffocating feeling that she was about to lose Ben forever. The shadows around her seemed to stretch, twisting toward her, pulling her in like a whirlpool of darkness. The apartment itself felt as if it were alive, as if it were closing in, breathing with her, suffocating her. "Ben!" Rachel cried, but the words felt hollow, as if they didn't belong to her anymore. Eleanor took a step forward, her eyes locked onto Rachel's. "Don't worry," she purred, her voice thick with malice. "He'll join us soon enough. He'll belong to this place, just like you." Rachel's eyes darted around, her pulse racing in her ears. The walls felt like they were pressing in on her, the apartment bending and twisting, reshaping itself into something darker, more sinister. The shadows seemed to grow taller, their edges sharp, their whispers louder. She looked at Ben's lifeless body, held in Eleanor's arms, and something inside her snapped. The terror, the helplessness, it all boiled over into a white-hot surge of rage. "No!" Rachel screamed, her voice raw with emotion. "You won't take him!" She charged forward, but as she did, the world around her seemed to shatter. The floor beneath her feet cracked open like dry earth, the apartment falling away into the abyss. The door to the hallway swung shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. But then, a faint sound reached her ears. A tiny cry, a soft, broken sound that made her blood run cold. It was Ben. Rachel whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. The shadows closed in around her, but she could see it now. Ben's form, still lying in the corner of the room, but his body was changing. It was shifting, his face contorting as though being pulled in all directions. His eyes were wide open, but they were no longer his eyes. They were hollow, empty. "No!" Rachel shouted, her hands trembling as she reached out for him. "Ben, please!" But as she moved closer, the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around her like tendrils of smoke, tightening, suffocating her. They wrapped around her, pulling her away from Ben, pulling her toward the door. A soft, insidious laughter echoed from the darkness. "You'll never leave," Eleanor whispered. "Not now. Not ever." Rachel's chest tightened as she was pulled back, her vision darkening with each passing moment. Her legs felt weak, and she stumbled, her hand grasping at the air, desperate to hold on to something, anything. And then she felt it. A cold hand, delicate but firm, gripped her wrist, pulling her further into the abyss. Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she turned, her mind screaming in horror. Standing there, just behind her, was a figure, a shadow flickering in and out of focus. But she knew who it was. She knew it in her bones. It was Ben, but it wasn't him. His form was distorted, his face a grotesque mask of what had once been. His skin was pallid, stretched tight over his skull, and his eyes were wide open, but empty, like the eyes of the other spirits who haunted the apartment. He was no longer the man she loved. He was a hollow shell, a puppet controlled by the cursed building, and he was reaching for her. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat as she stumbled backward, her feet tripping over the uneven floor. She couldn't take her eyes off him, couldn't tear herself away from the horrific sight. The Ben she knew was gone, and in his place there was only a twisted, empty version of him. I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't do this. I can't save you." The shadows seemed to close in around them both, their voices a cacophony of whispers, screeches, and moans. The walls of the apartment were crumbling now, the floor sinking away into darkness, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. And then, just as everything seemed to fall away into the void, Rachel heard one last whisper. "You're not leaving. Not now. Not ever." Her heart stopped. And then all was quiet. The silence in the apartment was deafening. Rachel's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she stood frozen, surrounded by the ever-encroaching darkness. The last whisper, that voice, her own voice, had faded, and now there was only stillness, a heavy and oppressive stillness that pressed down on her from all sides. She didn't know how long she stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe. The shadows were everywhere now. They were in the corners of the room, clinging to the walls, creeping along the floor, watching her, waiting. And through it all, she could feel the cold hand still gripping her wrist, dragging her toward the depths of this nightmare. Ben, her voice cracked as she whispered his name, her eyes locked on the twisted version of him standing in front of her. He was still there, but he wasn't Ben. Not anymore. The hollow gaze, the twisted grin, he was gone, lost to whatever this place had become. And yet, she couldn't pull herself away. She couldn't stop looking at him, drawn to the emptiness that radiated from him like a beacon. She took a slow, shaky step back, but it was as though the room itself was shifting around her. The floor creaked underfoot, and the walls seemed to twist, their lines bending, pulling her in. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, hungry, feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every passing second. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to reach out, curling around her, suffocating her. And then the laughter came, low at first like a soft murmur, but quickly rising to a crescendo of hollow, mocking sounds. It was coming from everywhere, from the shadows, from the walls, from the empty air itself. Rachel pressed her hands to her ears, but it didn't stop. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was vibrating through her very bones. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She could feel herself losing control, slipping further and further into the blackness. She couldn't escape. There was no way out. The shadows were closing in, tightening their grip around her, and the apartment seemed to pulse with an unholy rhythm, as if the building itself were alive and breathing. And then, through the chaos of whispers and laughter, a voice broke through. It was faint at first, just a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Rachel!" She turned sharply, her pulse racing, her body frozen in terror. "Ben," she breathed, her voice trembling. But the figure standing in the doorway wasn't Ben. It was Eleanor. Her face was twisted in that same sickening grin, her eyes wide and gleaming with malice. But there was something else in her expression now, something darker, more desperate. "You don't belong here, Rachel," Eleanor said, her voice now sharp like a knife. "You never did. But you're here now, and there's no going back." Rachel shook her head frantically, her body trembling with fear. "No, I want to leave. I don't belong here. Please." "You belong to this place now," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cold and final. "You and Ben both. This is your home now." Rachel's mind was spinning, her thoughts jumbled. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on her, her chest tightening with every breath. The room was warping, shifting, as if it were alive, breathing along with her. The shadows twisted into grotesque shapes, their edges blurring, their forms shifting like smoke. The apartment itself was changing, becoming something darker, something more sinister. "Please," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. "Please let me go. Let me leave." But Eleanor's eyes only gleamed brighter, her smile widening impossibly wide. "There's no leaving," she said, her voice soft, almost pitying. "You've crossed the line. There's no way out. You're part of it now, part of us." Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. This was it. There was no escape. The apartment, the darkness, the shadows, it was all a part of her now. It was all a part of them. And then, as if to confirm her worst fear, she felt it. A cold presence at her back. A shadow moving behind her, too close, too real. She spun around, but there was no one there, except for the eyes. In the darkness, just beyond the edges of the room, she saw them, glowing, burning with an unnatural light. Eyes. Thousands of eyes, all staring at her, watching her, waiting. She took a step back, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The eyes grew closer, swirling around her like an endless sea of blackness. They blinked in unison, their gaze unblinking, unrelenting. "Rachel," a whisper, so close now, so cold. It came from the darkness itself, and she felt the chill of it seep into her skin, her bones. You're mine now, forever. Her stomach twisted with horror, and she felt the darkness closing in on her. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they all seemed to tilt, to bend, to curl inward like a cage. She was trapped. She was caught. Then something tugged at her. Something pulled her, hard, yanking her backwards. Her feet left the floor, and she was thrown into the shadows, into the depths of the apartment, the air thick with the smell of decay and dust. Her screams died in her throat as the darkness swallowed her whole. The shadows pressed in on her, suffocating her, until there was no more light. No more sound. No more air. Just silence. And then in that silence, there was only one thing left. The eyes. The glowing, unblinking eyes. Staring. Watching. Waiting. Forever. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams.